From Moscow, the road led south through Malo and toward Kaluga. Here, the humanity of the commanders began to mount. Here, the inhumanity of the commanders began to mount. The remaining troops' weapons were inspected, and many who did not have their weapons fairly rust-free got 12 to 20 strokes with a club until they were near desperation. Needless to say, this is not good leadership. Hey, you want your people to keep their weapons squared away, but if you're actually going to beat them and make them less combat effective, you better find a better solution for your situation. Here we go, back to the book. The enemy attacked us. The enemy army behind us shattered all the Army Corps, leaving each of us then without his commanding officer. Those who were too weak to carry their weapons or knapsacks threw them away, and all looked like a crowd of gypsies. Everything was in confusion, and during almost the whole night the throng had to retreat to Moshesek, everyone running so as to not fall into the hands of the enemy. Because of these considerable losses, cannon, munition wagons, coaches, and baggage wagons by the hundreds had to be thrown into the water, and where that was impossible, all wagons were burned, not one wheel being permitted to remain whole. So now, as they're retreating, they don't want to leave this stuff behind, so they're throwing it into the rivers and setting the wagons on fire as they're retreating in total disrepair and disorganization. The fighting, the shrieking, the firing of large and small guns, hunger and thirst, and all conceivable torments increased the never-ending confusion. Indeed, even the lice seemed to seek supremacy, for their number on both officers and privates was in the thousands. In these days, it snowed for the first time, and the snow remained. The cold arrived at the same time too, and the freezing of people multiplied the number of dead. No one could walk 50 paces without seeing men stretched out, half or completely dead. Similar situation that militaries seem to get into is lack of good winter clothing. It happens all the time, and that's what happens here. These guys are not prepared for this type of situation. They're not prepared for this cold. The distress mounted higher and higher, and horses were shot and eaten. Because I could not even get a piece of meat and my hunger came too violent, I took along the pot I carried, stationed myself beside a horse that was being shot, and caught up the blood from its breast. I set this blood on the fire, let it coagulate, and ate lumps without salt. The Russians advanced and waited us at Minsk. Everyone hastily fled. Cannon were thrown into the water. The hospitals were nearly all left to the enemy, and, as was commonly rumored, the hospitals were set afire and burned with their inmates. All the time, the greatest misery fell upon the poor sick, who usually had to be thrown from the wagons just to keep us from losing the horses and wagons entirely, and who were left to freeze. Left to freeze among the enemies, for whomever remained lying behind could not hope to be rescued. The march had to go on, and the striking, clubbing, and skirmishing commenced so frightfully that the cry of murder echoed all about. The Cossacks advanced upon the army from all sides. Again and again people died and sometimes froze to death. These were people who pressed toward the fire but were seldom permitted to get there. So they died away from the fire, and very often they were even converted into cushions in order that the living would not have to sit in the snow. you've got situations where you're not only fighting against the enemy, but the troops are robbing and fighting each other, and in some cases murdering each other. And he talks about this, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. I kind of jumped into them and the fires, and what happened was there's so little fuel for the fires that they would form teams of 6 to 8 guys and gather up wood, and then that team would sit around the fire. And it's so cold that if you're not next to the fire, you're going to freeze to death. But if you didn't participate in helping to build the fire, then you don't get to sit next to the fire. So if you were too weak, if you were too hungry, if you were too thirsty, and you couldn't carry your load and get firewood, you weren't going to be permitted to sit next to the fire, which meant you're going to sit out there 20 feet from the fire and you're going to freeze to death. Back to the book. In every bivouac, soldiers who looked like specters crept around at night. The color of their faces, their husky breathing, and their dull muttering were horribly evident. For wherever they went, they remained hopeless. And no one allowed these shades of death to drag themselves to the fire. Usually 6, 8, or 10 of us had to combine to build a fire, since no other wood was to be had except rafter pieces from burned houses or trees lying around, shattered wagons, etc. And without the cooperation of the men, nothing could be accomplished. Neither did we dare to fall asleep at the fire at the same time, because no one was safe from stealing and robbery. Officers were beaten away from the fire just as privates were whenever they tried to press forward without merited claim. Only mutual support still procured true friendship. So they didn't care anymore. If you're an officer, it doesn't matter. If you didn't put out and build this fire, you're not going to get close to it. And I mentioned very quickly lice, and at one point he hooks up with a major, and they kind of become swim buddies trying to work together. And here we go to the book. We came to a lumber yard and built a fire there. When the major had become somewhat warm, his subjects, and by subjects he's referring to lice, plagued him with unusual wickedness. And for this reason, he asked me to kill the tormentors in his shirt collar. I did it. But when I had opened his collar, his raw flesh showed forth where the greedy beasts had gnawed in. I had to turn my eyes away with abhorrence and reassure the master that I saw nothing, telling him that my eyes hurt so much from the smoke that I could not see anything. These pests, however, were no less to be found on me, thousands of them. However, because of my constant restlessness, they could not get to the point of forcing me to treat them with flesh. So the lice is actually eating his friend, the major. And lice are no joke.
It's like body lice.
Yeah, body lice. Yeah, body lice. Like what kids get, like what your kids get from school. I don't know if your daughter's had it yet, but she will.
Well, I remember back when we were in school, it'd be like in your hair.
Yeah,
right?
for sure. For sure. That's where it starts.
I don't think I've ever seen I heard of it.
Yeah, and actually I read that section to my wife, because my wife, like all moms, absolutely despise lice.
Yeah.
Because when they come home from school, and it's this total nightmare. You got to everything's got to get washed, and my daughters all had crazy long, thick hair.
Yeah.
And so it would be hours of picking through that hair trying to get the lice out when that would break out.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is you have the treatment for it, right?
The shampoo.
You have the shampoo, and you have you clean your clothing, and so it's gone. But what happens if you don't do that? What happens if you don't do that? What happens if they don't have any shampoo? What happens if you have to wear the same clothes over and over and over and over again? And by the way, you can't take the clothes even off because you'll freeze to death. So what happens? You got a nice little home for the lice, and they start to eat.
Eat you.
Yes. And also, and so this whole time, obviously they're retreating. They'd been defeated, and they were retreating this whole time, and they're still being attacked. They're still being attacked by the Russians. Back to the book. The Russians pressed nearer and nearer from every side, and the murdering and tormenting seemed about to annihilate everyone. That day, we expected that everyone must be captured, killed, or thrown into the water. Everyone thought that his last hour had come, and everyone was expecting it. And so they're kind of trapped. And that's what he's saying. He's expecting that everyone's dead. We're all going to die or get thrown in the water. And they get to a bridge. And there's actually two bridges. One of them gets destroyed. And now there's all these guys trying to get across one bridge to get to safety. They're being attacked. Back to the book. Everyone crowded together into a solid mass, and nowhere could one see a way out or a means of rescue. From morning till night, we stood unprotected from cannonballs and grenades, which the Russians hurled at us from two sides. At each blow, from 3 to 5 men were struck to the ground, and yet no one was able to move a step to get out of the path of the cannonballs. Only by filling up of the space where a cannonball made room could one make a little progress forward. I think that has to be one of the most insane situations that I've ever heard of. You're standing in a mass of people, hundreds and hundreds of people, trying to get across a bridge. It's very slow movement. You have nowhere to hide, and there's cannonballs from two sides that are ripping through the people, and the only progress you make is by stepping on and filling the holes of where these men have gone to the ground and died. And by the way, you're starving, thirsty, covered in lice, freezing. And this is always encouraging. Back to the book. Moreover, here in this region, Napoleon had left us and fled with the fresh reserve troops hurrying home ahead of the army. The general cry was, "Save himself who can." So, again, myself included, we do a lot to glorify Napoleon. But here he is. His men are trapped, and a fresh group of reserves show up, and he hightails it out of there with the fresh reserves. He eventually gets across that bridge, and now they're just every man for himself. But it's not really every man for himself, because they got to link up with a couple other people to support each other, to protect each other, because it's just chaos. Back to the book. It had been the fate of many hundreds when they sat down because of weakness or necessity, that their clothing had been brutally torn from them, and where they could not defend themselves, they froze to death naked. So now you got the choice. I see you got to stop. Either you're tired, or you're weak, or maybe you just got to stop and go to the bathroom. Well, I see you in a compromised state, and I come over and just take your clothes from you, rip them off you. Why? Because I want to be warm. And it's you or me.
Dang. And that's his own team.
That's his own team. His own team right there. And it just, again, obviously, like I always have to do with these books, I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. Brutal.